it's crucial. It's insanely valuable for parents of young kids to have a backyard.
Hello and welcome to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're bringing you the smart conversations with people in the know, combined with actionable ideas that you won't hear anywhere else.
So just this past week on April 26th, the New York Times had a story that caught my attention, and it starts with a couple, Riley Stewart and Brock Goodwin, who grew up in Utah, where big families are basically part of the culture. They got married last year. They bought a 2,000 square foot home just outside of Salt Lake City, where I assume they work, and they assumed that kids would follow. And then the math hit them. So they had something like a $3,200 monthly mortgage payment. The groceries were going up in costs, and they felt like they didn't have any room to grow without leaving Utah and their family. So they decided not to have children at all. In fact, Riley says at the end of her section in the article, if we were rich, I would definitely have kids. So I think their story landed with a lot of people because, unfortunately, it isn't unusual anymore. We see that 3 out of 5 Gen Zers and millennials say that financial concerns have influenced their decision not to have children or caused them to delay that. So the U.S. fertility rate, if you haven't been following it, is now below 1.6, which is below the 2.1 level that's sort of expected to replace human beings. And so we're also aware of the fact that housing costs have gone up. And I think a recent report I read, I think it was Lending Tree, said that the cost of raising a child through age 18 is now $303,000. Well, it's actually $303,418, a very specific number in 2026. And anyway, they claim that's up 28% since 2023 alone. So I say all of that to kind of introduce kind of an interesting episode today. We're going to kind of dig into this question, which is the baby bust, at least in part, a housing issue? And if that's really the case, what does that mean for how we build, finance, and regulate homes in America? So Jeremy and I often don't get to have a conversation about housing that's connected to the extinction of humanity, but that's what I think we're going to have today. We have an amazing guest. It's Tim Carney, who is a senior fellow at AEI. He's a columnist at the Washington Examiner, author of many books. Most recently, his book, Family Unfriendly, kind of makes the cultural case for why America has systematically made family formation harder. I highly recommend it. It's a great book. Tim's a longtime friend of mine. If you can, just pause this episode, go on Amazon and order his book, Family Unfriendly. You will not regret it. So as Tim's been thinking about this topic, he's started to zero in on the connection between housing and fertility. So Tim, we're super excited to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into this topic. I'll assume everyone who just bought your book on Amazon is now back listening in to our conversation. And so your book, Family Unfriendly, is arguing for this cultural phenomenon, that primarily this is a cultural phenomenon about secularization, individualism, a prioritization of self-fulfillment and self-fulfillment over community in a lot of cases. And so obviously that's a housing formation, housing problem. But before we dive right into that, I'm curious if you could kind of frame that up for us. Because when I hear systematically creating these obstacles, it sounds intentional. And yet a lot of what we're talking about here sounds more like peer pressure, right? And so can you kind of walk through the drivers here? What are the deep drivers here, and how can we better understand them?
So marriage and family formation have really been falling almost nonstop since 2007. And so a lot of people will put the beginning at the financial crisis. But when you realize birth rates were much higher during the Great Recession than they were in, say, 2019, when we had the best economy we've ever had, you realize you can't just put it on economics. Similarly, Gen X generation, at least John and I are in. I don't know about you, but
proud millennial.
Yeah. So Gen X, we were not richer than you millennials or than Gen Z at a given age, yet we had a few more babies. So like across generations, across place, I point to multiple studies in Family Unfriendly that the geography of costs of childcare or the geography of student loan debt doesn't predict birth rates. So the economic factor, I don't say it's a non-factor, but I do focus on culture. And I mean that in a lot of ways. I mean parenting culture. It's a big topic that hit Derek Thompson wrote about this recently, that parenting has become much more intensive. That's a big focus of early in my book, whether it's helicopter parenting or travel sports replacing Little League. And then you've also got cultural values. What do people really care about? And I don't argue that people are more selfish now than they used to be. I don't believe that, but I just think we are more individualistic. I think that, again, career self-fulfillment, or trying to, you live only one life, make sure it really counts. That individualistic mindset is just more present now than it used to be. Then also just the cultural values of supporting family is a big deal. And I always say, a wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child. Now, what Hillary Clinton meant when she used that quote, I don't know. But as my wife and I, we raised 6 kids, but we don't raise those 6 kids ourselves. We rely on neighbors. We rely on Little League coaches. We rely on teachers and pastors and friends. And Katie's parents right now are watching the kids while I record, watching the youngest while I record this. And who knows who's taking care of the older ones, and who knows who's going to drive them home. And so as our culture sort of thinks about children less, it becomes harder for those who are raising children because they have less community support. So all of these cultural factors both make people less likely to want kids and make it harder for those who have them.
Yeah, one thing I really liked about your book, Tim, is how it made the argument in a way that I think would be unexpected of somebody who's a devout Catholic and who has 6 children. You didn't write the book sort of saying you should have children and children are a great thing, even though you could have. And I've read some critiques that said it would be nice if you had a chapter at the end that would say, like, here are all the great things about having kids. But more so, you make the argument that people actually want to have kids. Like the number of kids that people want to have today is not the number of kids they're actually having. And so there's something to it. And I just kind of wanted to frame that up and maybe get your thoughts on that, which is, this is not about, a sort of religious appeal to be fruitful and multiply, which I'm sure you would make, but this is about something even just more fundamentally problematic, which is like, we're not doing the things that we want to do.
That's right. I mean, the Gallup has asked people, what is the ideal number of children in a family? And it fell from, it used to be between 3 and 4 in like the 50s and 60s. And it fell down to between 2 and 3. And it's been there since the 70s. In fact, in recent years, since the end of the pandemic, it's been going up. And so 2.7 is now the average answer. Now, if you narrow that down, and I point to different studies of, say, well, what if you only ask like women of childbearing age? It goes down only slightly, still well above 2. But there's another way to ask a very similar question. There's, what is your ideal family size? And then there's, how many children do you intend to have? And that's where the biggest drop off has happened. That the how many do you intend to have and what is your ideal used to be very close until, again, shortly after the 2007. And then they started to diverge, where people are saying, well, ideally I'd have 2.5, but really it comes out to like about 2 or slightly below. But then we fall even short of that, as you said, 1.6. So we've got those two gaps from our ideals to our intentions, and then our intentions to what we actually get. And just focusing on that, I thought was the most fruitful thing to do. And so that's what I wrote the book about.
Yeah, and I just make another comment. I want you to maybe say another word on this, which is, I don't know if you read the Times piece that I quoted at the start, but it was a little shocking to hear this first couple in Utah say their house is only 2,000 square feet, and that's a limitation. Being a kid in a family of 5 that lived in 1,000 square foot home, like, but then like other couples in that story were like, well, like, I'd have to give up golfing, right? So, like, again, that sort of points, like, the first story was framed very much as an economic issue, like the cost of my mortgage is high, all of these things, and I think the thrust of the article is like economics are the issue, but then you kind of end with this couple is like, well, actually, I just prefer golfing than having children. So, anyway, can you say more about the sort of cultural changes in our norms? Because I think most people have the tendency to want to just claim this is an economic issue, and talking about housing is going to make it somewhat of an economic issue. But how do you separate those two drivers?
Again, I go through time and space and across generations, and I agree. I mean, to hint and skip ahead a tiny bit, I think to the degree it's an economic issue, it's a housing issue. But to return to culture for 1 second, What I don't like to do is say, sorry, you spoiled millennials and your avocado toast, um, because I don't think that's productive. And again, I think everybody's selfish. But on the other hand, I do think that sort of part of it is a self reinforcing thing. If all of your friends are still playing golf, then having a kid might mean giving up golf. And but if your friends are one by one dropping off of it, dropping off of the Sunday morning brunches that are, 3 hours long and boozy, then all of a sudden you're more likely to do it. So part of it is, what are the cultural norms? I played golf when I had very little kids. That's actually when I started playing golf, because I had to quit playing baseball because that was too time consuming. So I started playing golf. But guess what? Once I had like kids in school and there was drop off and yada yada, then I quit golf. I hope to pick it back up if I can get my sons to play with me. So there are sacrifices to parenting, but it also used to just kind of be what was expected. And I think there was something healthy to it. Sometimes it could be constraining to have all these life scripts written for you, but guess what, it's absolutely paralyzing to just get handed a blank page and be like, guess what, you get to be the author of your whole life script. I think that's part of the problem. Millennials and Gen Z have all this anxiety, is that they don't have like a fill in the blank script. It's just a blank page.
Well, the blank page was not only you can have or do whatever you want, the blank page was also you can have it all too. It was actually a real dichotomy, I think, between write your own script, but make sure you're dreaming at the highest level of success and the highest level of achievement while you're writing that script. So there did feel like a lot, just speaking as one elder millennial, there was a lot of pressure there. But one of the things you're bringing up that I think resonates with me is this really hard challenge that you're researching between irrational behavior and telling yourself it's rational even when it's not type of behavior. And I think a lot of times that's where the economic piece comes in. We know, just as people are selfish in every generation, people are also irrational a lot of times with decision making, how it works, why it works, and what they choose. So, how do you think about some of the balance of our ability to make these irrational decisions all day, every day, and then claim rational decisions in these other areas like having kids or not?
Well, I mean, so part of it is that, like, I talk about having kids as like it's being on the total other side of the lake. Like, you don't know what it's like over there. And so how do you ever make a rational decision about a massive unknown? Well, a big part of it is you talk to and are just constantly exposed to people who have been through it. So again, as falling birth rates and then, more and more childless people in the cities, then there are fewer people to just look at and be like, oh, I see how you handle having three kids, is that your 8-year-old is looking after the 4-year-old. Or, okay, wait a second, you actually do get some sleep after a few months. Or, hey, that kid is really cute and looks kind of fun. So part of it is that there is no rational sort of path from being unmarried without children to knowing what being a parent is going to be like. It's totally different world. It's an exposure to people of that lifetime. And all the millennials have been through this period, but like, we had a period, John and I have known each other for a while, from what, 2005 to 2008, where we were at like 10 weddings a year, because it just spread like crazy. And then the babies were born. And we're always surprised when we catch up. We're like, oh wait, your kid's a high school sophomore, my kid's a high school. Oh yeah, we had our babies in batches. So part of it is that the rational can't get you to the other side of the lake, the exposure to those things. But the irrationality, one of the things I talk about early in the book is the fear of kidnappers, because it's one of the most terrifying ideas that your kid would get, murdered or kidnapped or something. The real number is that, like, a stranger abduction, it almost never happens. But if it happens once a week in the United States, that means there's less than a 1 in a million chance that any of your kids will even know anybody who this happens to. But it'll be on the news, and now it'll be in your algorithm when it happens once a week in the United States. So our sort of our ape brains, our primate brains, think it's happening all around us, when really it's. But try to tell that to a parent. Oh, well, you're not being totally rational in your risk calculation. No, we're going to be emotional and be overprotective. So that's one of the things that makes parenting culture harder.
Yeah, I think there's a never-ending series of millennial mothers talking about how awful it is and how challenging it is. And one of the things that really struck me, I think it's in the introduction of your book, and I'll probably mischaracterize this when you can correct me, but since women have joined the workforce, men have spent a lot more time with their kids. Sort of,
Yep.
you'd think, okay, that makes sense. But the shocking finding that you have is that women are actually spending even more time with their kids now that they've joined the workforce.
Yep.
And it just sort of, you see this in a lot of people when they talk about parenting, it's just how horrible and hard and terrible it is, which kind of, makes the other side of the lake just seem like a place you never want to go.
I blame the momfluencers, and there's both. There's what you're describing, the parenting is hell genre, where it's just you have to do all of this and everything relies on you. And to some extent, when the baby's a newborn, there's not a lot of outsourcing. But guess what? What have we always done? We've relied on extended family. We've relied that gets omitted from a lot of this, and half of the reason for that is the other side of the momosphere, which is the like everything is perfect. Look at me. I have six beautiful kids and I live on a farm and do ballet. Like that is insane. Because there's this one scholar I follow, I started reading who's like a scholar getting her PhD in the momosphere on momfluencers. She pointed out there's never any neighbors in the momfluencers Instagram posts because well the family's the one making all the money off of this. What are you gonna do? Like pay your neighbor to come by once in a while, like Kramer or something? No. So it gives off this myth that well, first of all, these rich people's nannies aren't showing up, but just regular people who rely on their neighbors and their mother-in-law, they don't show up. So it creates this false image of parenthood as this totally isolated thing where mom and dad get no help. And that so whether that's the everything's perfect, which like I can't live up to that, or everything's hell, I don't want that. I blame a lot of social media for the problem.
That's really interesting. Can we dig into the other side of that coin? Because I think they're called influencers because it does actually
Hmm.
influence us, right? And so you mentioned something that's one of the topics that will drive us pretty much directly into housing, and that's density.
Hmm.
When we see some of these different models, we see communities going further and further out from an urban center to get more of that space or to try to find affordability in some cases. There's a lot of reasons why we're seeing that expansion. And yet, we also see a lot of research that says density is more efficient, density is a better way to deliver services. And it sounds a little like density also means you might be closer to neighbors and your community associations and your church and your family members, like your parents and whomever else. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about density relative to family formation affordability and what we should be thinking about in housing?
I think it's one of the biggest questions, and it's mostly still a question. This is one of the reasons I'm launching research at this here at AEI, is because certainly, I mean, I live in the suburbs right outside of DC. I live on a cul-de-sac. Five houses in a row have kids ranging from like 2 to 19, and my kids are at the older end of it, but they play, and sometimes my middle schooler will go out and lead a game with all the 6 and 7 year olds. And that once a one extra family moved in, we kind of reached this level where just the cul-de-sac got taken over by kids on their bikes. So like everybody now knows, like you basically park even before you get there if you're there on a Saturday, because there's going to be it's a biker gang is what I call it, of like 7 year olds. And so that density of families in a suburb where we're on top of a hill, so our backyards are mostly useless, and it just became clear like the front yards are fair game to everybody. Don't go into anybody's backyard, don't go into anybody's house without permission, but the front yards and the cul-de-sac are. So that just makes it so much better. Mom and dad are not entertaining the kids as much because the street is entertaining them. And so then the other thing is that if you're super spread out, say, the places in Connecticut where the minimum lot sizes are 2 acres, housing is going to be more expensive. And so density both gives you more kids nearby and makes housing cheaper. And then most urbanists put this at the top, but I put a little bit lower. It's closer to the 7-Eleven, the more dense you are. It's closer to those sort of things that adults consider third places. But then at a certain point, density, I think, is anti family. I mean, I I came from New York City, where we had a pretty big apartment, but we were across the street from Washington Square Park, and that was great. Most people in New York City, it's really hard to have a kid, or especially two kids. What you see in Japan with the depopulation there, because they don't just have a low birth rate, they are losing people every year. So the smaller towns don't have enough people to maintain anything. They're insufficient density. So the town literally shuts down. So the people then move to Tokyo, which is doing a great job of building more housing, but that's not family friendly. Something about being on a 13th floor, I believe, and I think John might disagree with me on this, but something about being on 13th floor, I think, is particularly anti-family. It's nice to have a backyard for anybody, but it's downright, like, almost, it's crucial. It's insanely valuable for parents of young kids to have a backyard.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with that. I mean, an interesting choice of the 13th floor. I guess I don't know the Taylor Swift reference or bad luck to be on the 13th floor. But I mean, I think what you're exploring, and Tim, in our earlier conversations on this topic, kind of a lot of times we talk about housing issues and it's really focused on affordability. And when you focus on affordability, you then focus on smaller sizes, and smaller sized homes. We look at creating new supply, but it's studios and one bedrooms, which helps with affordability, but hurts with the issue you're talking about. So I'm wondering, like, as you kind of think of the balance, like, is and let's call it the family housing crisis, a function of a quantity issue, of meaning we need more homes, we need to drive prices down? Is it a type problem? In other words, we need more three-bedroom homes, we need more yards, we need more focus on putting families all in the same area so that they can all sort of be families together, versus like in cities where you have lots of millennials eating avocado toast. Like, anyway, how do you think about the problem? Is it both dimensions at the same time?
So I'm not going to object to increasing quantity, but at some point there's a trade off. And if a developer came to me and said, Tim, should I build 40 studios on this block, or should I build 10 townhouses? I would say build the 10 townhouses, because we have this low and falling birth rate, because we have people who want to get married and have children and aren't, and because the risk is that in the future, without any exposure to families, we're going to lose even that desire. And so, in I'm here in DC, like you, policymakers like things to be countable, but sometimes we count the wrong things. And if we're counting units as this is what we need, is units, and we're not, maybe it's better to count bedrooms. So that's one thing. This is how I got into I don't know if you guys follow the, like, single staircase Twitter. They might have left Twitter for Blue Sky or whatever, but it's just obsessed with the regulations requiring two staircases, and how it changes everything to be the apartments to being like bookshelves, instead of more interesting apartments that can include three bedrooms, that can include a family. So whether it's more family friendly apartments or more townhomes or whatever, I do think the nature of the type really does matter. And I said townhomes because sometimes I feel like that's the way to get it dense, have a small backyard, big enough for your 2-year-old to run around in, big enough to have one of family over for a barbecue. Ideally, it would open up to a big green common space that then the 6-year-olds can run around, or something like that. I think that the same quantity with different type and different built environment can have massively different effects on supporting families.
And just to note, that also addresses some of the cost we were talking about earlier, because you mentioned the cost, of acquiring that unit because of how it was built. Perhaps it has a list price, that you can get into it. But I've also had a lot of peers, so this is informal peer research, talk about all the things they didn't know about home ownership before getting into it. You mentioned we want to be spending time with our kids. We want to be watching them play Little League. We want to be teaching them how to play golf. We want to be taking walks in the neighborhood with them, not fixing that thing in the basement, fixing that thing in the attic, fixing the thing in the backyard. And the upkeep of some of what used to be called a starter home is increasingly costly, both in time and money. And a lot of times we undersell the time component of home ownership, and it takes you away from doing other things that you want to do. Whereas, like, a
Yeah.
townhouse, at least maybe you have a more manageable space. I don't know, but do you have a thought on sort of that component of this conversation as well?
This is interesting because I've been all over the place on this, and I do talk a little bit about this in my book. Before my boys were old enough to mow the yard, I hired a kid to mow my lawn. And so he was a high school kid, and I kind of felt like I was a shirker. Here I was, an able-bodied adult, and I was paying this guy to mow my lawn. And my wife was like, "What were you doing when he showed up last Saturday?" I was like, "Well, I wasn't even here. I was at the zoo with the kids." "How about 2 Saturdays before that?" "Well, that's when, yeah, I was taking them to the driving range or whatever." And then I realized I wasn't paying to get my lawn mowed. I was paying to have Saturday morning with my kids. On the other hand, then when we rented, I sometimes was when we moved from Maryland to Virginia, first we were renting, I was driven crazy by the lack of like home improvements I could do. I own a chainsaw that I love using. And I was like, my neighbors were like, "Carney, you're going to come over and like chop down a tree on my yard because you can't do it in your own, aren't you?" Maybe I didn't actually do it, but I was tempted. But then I kind of liked calling somebody and getting them to fix the HVAC. And, so that really is for me the biggest trade-off with time with the kids is these like home repairs. Although I did once get my high school, my freshman son to fix the water heater while I was away, so my wife could take a hot bath. So that was sort of a nice father-son moment. But yeah, I mean, whether it's renting or getting a easier to handle townhouse, there are family-friendly aspects to that lower maintenance world.
I want to go back to the housing type thing and the townhouse idea. And you mentioned single stairs, so it's going to take us down to what I think is a fairly obvious direction, which is discussions around zoning. And so, there's a lot of negative talk around the NIMBYs, and the NIMBYs are preventing homes from being built. And so I kind of see a tension in that, specifically related to this topic, because a lot of NIMBYs can be sort of protecting a child-friendly neighborhood from density. So in other words, I love my neighborhood, I love my yard, I love our open courtyard space. I love the fact that there's not that many cars coming through here. So I want to prevent density. And so in that sense, you could almost say like NIMBYism is protecting a family friendliness of neighborhoods. But on the flip side, it's preventing new families from potentially being there. Or anyway, I know it's a really politically complex topic to talk about. I'm just wondering where your head's at right now in terms of zoning. Is that a positive or a negative thing when it relates to this topic?
I mean, I think maybe one of the more harmful ones that we would do, the best trade off is shrinking minimum lot sizes. And so that doesn't even address single family or attached or detached. But again, the minimum lot size, yeah, you shrink the minimum lot size, you get more traffic on the street. Is there a negative to that? Yes. But I think the positive of that outweighs the negative. And so that would be the first place that I would start. So to me, that's the easier one. There are other regulations besides zoning that matter, obviously. But I think in a lot of the way people talk about it in the suburbs, a lot of time is the missing middle, which is their way of saying, well, we're trying to make it so that you don't have to have either a McMansion or an apartment building, but a small single family house. And the term starter house, I mean, it matters. Like, it's what we did. We bought a single family house that was about 900 square feet. And then we upgraded when kid number 5 was born. And like, especially if to the degree that housing is an investment, it's nice if people can afford a house. And also just, there's something about the American psyche where at least a house has to be within reach for you to start a family for a lot of people. I don't think it should have to be that way, but that's the way a lot of us think. And so any regulations, including minimum lot size regulations or off-street parking regulations or anything like that, any of those rules that make it less economical than it already is to build a modest single family house, those are all anti-family. So I don't, again, I'm early in this process, but I think if you were to say 10 years from now, our housing stock is going to be a lot more family friendly, what would it look like? I think it would be more townhomes, more single family homes, more densely packed in on smaller lots. Apartments would be part of it, but I think that sort of increased in suburban housing supply, my suspicion is that would be the biggest part of it.
One of the things that we struggle with on Housing Insiders, which is also the reason we have these conversations, is that housing can get so complex so quickly in talking to public officials, talking to city councils, talking about zoning, that you have kind of this stacking of layers or issues that everybody has to concern. And it kind of gets so heavy that people just
Yes.
walk away from it. Do you get that sense when you tie zoning to quality of life? And do you see an argument for, think of it as like a playbook as people are talking to their local communities of what we're trying to do here with intentionality? Are you starting to formulate a thought around zoning being a net good or net bad tool for family friendliness, or is it too soon to tell?
I mean, I'm going to come at your question from another perspective. I would want us to talk about families, to talk about kids and parents up front when we're talking about zoning. You know, I say I always want to bring the YIMBYs and the urbanists, who I'll agree with on a lot of things, together and say, okay, I read 10,000 words of you and 10,000 words of you, and none of those words were parents or child. You never, when you talked about walkability, you never once imagined that the person walking had legs that were like only this tall. You didn't mention strollers. Your talk of third places is all like places to get caffeine, alcohol, or like books, used books. I mean, what about a place to play, pick up basketball, or just, I say, around the corner from my house, there's this one house, that a corner lot that has a big bush in it, but the middle of the bush is sort of hollowed out because there's a fire hydrant in it. So it's like a bush cave. That's a third place for my kids. Like, nothing's for sale. There's no commerce that happens there. Nobody is going to make you a really good Manhattan there, but it's a third place. And so that's my kids' ability to walk there really matters. So that's the main thing that I would say is the people who are talking about housing and urbanism, I want them to think about family and kids. And I want them to give almost a preference and a priority to that, because that's a crisis we're having now. How to talk to communities and politicians. I mean, you guys probably have a lot more experience on that than I do, but I think, again, if you're saying what we want is more families, sure, you can imagine people objecting to that and thinking, oh no, we're going to get more poor families, or it's going to, or, you know, some retiree being like, it's going to be old, the kids are going to be on my front yard, get off my lawn. But I think that a lot of the resistance to building is massive influx of like singletons into a family neighborhood, and to say, hey, this is a great family neighborhood. You know what? You notice how, you know, say to the grandma, you notice how your kids can't afford to live here? You know, it would be able to make it easier for you to live near your grandkids? A few more houses.
Yep. I want to run a few. I mean, Jeremy and I spent a lot of time with, everyone from, Mike Kinsella from, who's a famous YIMBY, but we talked to innovators and people that are always coming up with interesting new housing solutions. So both policies and regulations, but also just interesting ideas. So I want to run a few of them by you, but to preface it, just to start off a little, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on this, because one could very easily say that America has spent a lot of money, has worked actively to subsidize ownership. And
Mm-hmm.
the view of subsidizing ownership has always been that when people own their home, they're more likely to care about their community, they're more likely to be civic minded. And so, in some ways, the American government has put its thumb on the scale in renting versus owning. And compared to other countries, we have more owners. And one might say, and that relates very much to this topic, that's a positive thing that the government can choose to influence. And so, even just before kind of talking about some of these solutions, do you think the government or policy in general has a role on maybe putting its thumb on the scale to create a housing environment where it's easier to have families?
Yes. Obviously, we don't want government dictating, but there are going to be zoning rules. And we're at some point, I mean, right now, as it is, local governments want as much commerce as possible because that generates more tax. One local leader said to me, families are a liability, businesses are an asset. And so he was putting his finger on the scale for commerce rather than residential. And a lot of places, they say they're just targeting units. So as long as government is making these decisions, I want them to be making the decisions for family. That question of ownership, actually, that you bring up, it's like, it cuts both ways. Family is something that's permanent. You want to be there for a while, and it's more of a pain to get kicked out when you have multiple kids, especially if you're in a school district. But on the other hand, if what we need is more supply and more affordability and people to be able to start a household before having saved up $100,000, then, well, renting cuts in that favor. So, but yes, I'm in favor of a thumb on the scale in favor of families at this point. I wouldn't always say that. I mean, I could imagine that I could live in some other culture where there's just a ton of families, and the singleton is the one who's getting left out or something. But right now, again, people want to get married and have kids and are finding an obstacle to it. It's mostly cultural to the degree it's economic. It's mostly about housing.
Yeah, and I mean, I talked to the local kind of official or even the broader politician, and I was talking to a colleague this week talking about you want to help small businesses, you want to help local businesses, give them more customers. They don't need subsidy programs, they need more customers. So if you want to help a small business, let's put people there to shop in that small business or
That's a
buy those products.
revolutionary idea.
Imagine that. So we also wanted to talk a little bit about actual housing products and structures that we're seeing or that we're hearing about. And so I'll kick us off with one and just get your response to that. It's kind of been called house hacking in a lot of the ways and areas that I get into, and that's a new first time home buyer buying a 2 to 4 family unit home to start instead of what we have referred to on this show as a starter home. Now it is, I need to offset some of the costs. John mentioned the couple earlier who had the $3,200 a month mortgage. Well, for almost the same underwriting and likely an even lower monthly allocation of their personal funds into their housing payment, they can become landlords. They can move into one of the units, rent out the others. And I'm curious, assuming that stock was there, what would that do to that first time home buyer, or what would be your reaction to that strategy?
There's a simple, I mean, a story you could tell that just immediately popped into my mind, which is because I had friends on Capitol Hill who kind of did this. You buy the townhouse on Capitol Hill and you move into the basement and you rent out the 3 bedrooms that are on the ground floor and the second floor. And then you get married, you move upstairs, you rent out the basement. And then ideally, when you have kid number 3 or 4, the whole, and I had friends who did this, who rented out their basement until they had enough kids, and then they use that up, and then eventually your mother moves into the basement, and then eventually you move into your basement and your kids with their wives and kids move upstairs. So I think that, I mean, just again, that townhouse with the basement apartment thing, I think it works really well into that life cycle of the family.
Yeah, and there are a lot of great products that facilitate that. And certainly, as we upzone from 1 units to 2 units and have more 2 unit homes, that certainly allows for more of what Jeremy's talking about. There's the other issue that comes up a lot in terms of housing, especially right now, given that rates during COVID were 2.5% and they're now 6.5%. Is this kind of this lock-in problem that we see a lot? And the reason I
Mm-hmm.
raise that is because you've mentioned a couple, like moving up to your next home, like housing when it's very fluid and people can move from one place to another easily, it's helpful. So like if your parents can move closer to you and babysit, that's great. And so, but this lock-in effect has created this immobility that's really problematic. And so one thing I've thought a lot about is like, should we subsidize, or should the government do something to help unlock mortgages so that mortgages might be portable? So I'm curious to get your thoughts on just on mobility in terms of just our ability to move from place to another a little bit more fluidly. Do you think that would help in terms of creating communities for families?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky. I could just, so many subsidies end up having these, bizarre, unintended, sometimes unforeseen aspects. But I would, part of like what I would consider the boomer buyout is say, okay, you don't have to pay capital gains. Like forget the everything over half a million. You bought your house in 1964. It's now worth 1.2 and you bought it for 0.2. Congratulations. Like you get to keep the whole million. So that's a simple tax break that's pretty straightforward that I would give them. I also wouldn't do what's really popular today, which is exempting 60 plus people from paying their property taxes. Come on, that's like the worst possible thing in the world. I'm not gonna. I have friends who would say we should raise their property taxes if they're not like if they're not renting out one of the kids to the bedrooms to their kids. There are people who talk about vacant room taxes, etc. The two simple steps I would start with are stop doing this stupid thing of getting rid of property taxes for seniors and let them sell without having to pay capital gains. But then this is where we get into a complexity. Where are they going to move? This is where I see the high rises with the one bedrooms. Like, if there's more of those, then those become cheaper. The people with all these gains can move and not care about the mortgage rates because they can use all their, I don't know what number of people that is, but so this is one reason I say I don't complain about the apartment buildings being built, is that hopefully the boomers who eye that apartment say that'll be a lot easier than my single family house. I will sell and move out. But right now, when I talk to some of them, they say those one bedroom apartments are still super expensive. So maybe we could bring them down by massively increasing the supply.
I really like that conversation because whether it's a one-time capital gains holiday or some other policy, we do hear a lot research about it, but also just conjecture about this what they call the silver tsunami, which is, oh well, there's going to be this huge wealth transfer of cash and houses back to the kids at some point, and that's going to solve it for us. Like you'll see research that says like that's when all the units will open up, and whenever that happens, that's when it'll all balance out. And, for me, it's always been a matter of instead of trying to trigger or accelerate that, kind of share in it, find incentives that align to share in it. And so I'm curious if you, and I'm going to make it a little bit more broad and philosophical than that, but shared equity, shared interest in each other's property, whether that's the homeowner that we're trying to get to exit the 5-bedroom house because they don't need 5 bedrooms anymore, and giving them a lasting equity interest in the next owner also makes that a lower cost 5-bedroom house for the next person to walk into. And then you can do a variety of other things with that when it comes to down payments or other things where you're introducing an equity share model that lets one generation continue to benefit, but without getting all the gains. They've already had all the gains to where we are now. Can you talk a little bit about your initial reaction to something like shared equity models as bringing a community together, linking generations, or maybe too complex to actually do some of the things I'm suggesting?
I mean, this is the first time I've heard of it, and again, the lack of I mean, the lack of smoothness, the amount of friction in this market is a problem, as John was saying earlier. That I mean, even to he mentioned, your parents moved closer. I remember as a kid, I had a good friend who he lived next door to his grandma, and I just thought that would be great. Then now I don't know anybody who lives in a major metropolitan area who can do it. I have friends in Iowa, not in Des Moines, but in like the outer reaches of Iowa who can do that. They're like, oh, when we got married, we bought the house next door to my kids. That was possible in a lot of places. And so that's an example of the friction being a problem. So the shared equity idea to me, by making like a partial house be a thing, remove some of that massive $1 million hurdle from 0 to a million. And so anything we can do to do that, I think would be beneficial. So that would be the bigger picture thing, is how do we remove the massive frictions, the cliffs from this question, and get something a little more gradual.
Yeah, one other way that I've thought a lot about in terms of helping families be closer to one another is ADUs, or accessory dwelling units.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always interesting when people are trying to subsidize them. They're always like, "Well, we'll subsidize it if you at least have an 80 AMI or lower renter using the ADU." And I'm thinking to myself, well, boy, that really sucks, because like I think a lot of people just want their grandparents to move in,
Yeah.
or or something like, well, maybe they meet that qualification, but anyway, I've always thought of ADUs as a really interesting way to do something like what Jeremy mentioned, and if we could support those from a policy perspective, I think really just this idea that, hey, you can move back in with your parents and you don't have to live under the same roof, which I think
Yeah.
we joked on a previous episode. When you're living under the same roof as your parents, you're very unlikely to have another child, because you don't necessarily want to copulate with your mom next door. But anyway, ADUs. Anyway, just curious to get your views on ADUs. Like, you see that as as an important sort of policy, particularly for family friendliness.
I'm glad you've moved us on to the sex part of the podcast now, because it's what I
Well, we
was
are
looking
talking about
forward to.
fertility. I mean, it's
Yeah. No, so I mean, the first step is, where I live in Fairfax County, a detached ADU is not allowed. And I have this like massive, and again, like partly unusable backyard. It'd be great. Eventually, we might do it like above our garage, which is just sort of like a regulatory hack. But so the first thing is to legalize them. I don't know. Are you thinking? Have you seen municipalities or whatever subsidize it in a thoughtful way? I mean, again, subsidies always make me nervous. You and I were both here when they subsidized the demand of housing, and it didn't end well. So, what are you thinking on the subsidized ADUs?
Well, there's a few ways to think about it. I mean, I think one of the challenges is just financing the ADU that you're building. And the reason you might think about subsidizing it is, one, to what I mentioned earlier, is you want to create more rental housing for low income people
Yeah.
in the area. But the second is, you have a low income homeowner who's rich in equity but low in income, struggling to sort of maintain their financial stability, and being able to create a rental unit where they can generate income is a way to stabilize their housing as well. And so I think oftentimes when people talk about ADUs, that's the outcome they're looking for, and in a lot of cases are willing to subsidize, versus, the family instance of it, which may not be as sort of like might not as sell as well, but I do think there's a lot of true value to that for families.
Yeah, and it's possibly a halfway point when we're talking about these like minimum lot sizes or something like that. Is get one more person on the street, rather than four more lots on the street, and so theoretically that could build that up. But yeah, no, I think ADUs can help in all sorts of ways, reducing the friction, and I believe that multi-generational housing is really one of the most family friendly things. We talk in DC, when somebody says, well, how can we make raising kids more affordable? Everybody immediately jumps to universal childcare. And it's like, what most people want is their family and like best friends helping out and doing something like a co-op. What statistically on like pronatalism, getting help from your actual family makes it much more likely you have child number two. Having close and convenient institutional childcare does not make child number two as likely. So something, if we're boosting families here, helping people live next door to grandma is one of the most valuable things you can do, and ADUs might be one of the best ways to do it.
Well, now I have the ultimate millennial question for you, because you mentioned talking to people in the research about what I'm gonna about to call communal living. Because when I talk to millennials, it is almost to a person. When they find out I'm in housing, they talk about how come I can't live with my friends in units that are all on the same lot together, because that's all I really want. And John and I on the show talk a lot about how people will talk about the best time of their life being college,
Mm-hmm.
and then will be setting up the rest of their entire life for retirement. And both college and retirement tend to have one thing in common: communal living.
Yeah.
And then you talk to these millennials in the middle who are like, yeah, I would keep doing it if I could. Why doesn't that exist? Why isn't it there? Have you found that trend in your research? Have you heard that as a theme? Is it just my friends? What would be your response to that?
We have a loneliness crisis right now. And I mean, so I wrote an earlier book, Alienated America, back in 2019, and it was about how we're less likely to be involved, we're less likely to know our neighbors. And, since then, the COVID lockdowns accelerated that. We're less likely to know people, and we're more individualistic, and we're less likely to belong to clubs. I was on the board of this organization that we used to have members, and then at some point in like 2006, they're like, you can't call it a member because millennials don't want to join anything. So we were like, you can put in $20 and level up or something. And we came up with some millennial friendly term instead of members. And so, but the unwillingness to join doesn't mean that they don't have that natural instinct to be together in community with other people. Now, that communal, a bunch of singletons with a big common space. I remember there's a dorm at University of Pennsylvania that was specifically built that way. Like the guy was a Marxist who got the contract, and he was like small dorm rooms, big open space. Like there's a lot of people who like that idea. That's not family friendly, except if it helps not millennials now, but if it helps 20 somethings know one another and meet another person, and then they leave and go somewhere else. But I live in community with a bunch of single family suburban homes. There's a list that goes around. It's like, who can lend me a chainsaw? Who has a power washer? Let me borrow that. And then the kids running around on the cul-de-sac. And so for families, again, townhomes is living in community. And then, for the singleton 20 or early or, 30 somethings, it's going to be something else. But all of it is rooted in the fact that man is not made to be alone, whether it's a mom and dad and their kids, or whether it's a single person or a couple without kids. We all need to be out mixing. And there's really something to be said that the type of housing, I mean, if you read Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance, when he describes life in the holler, like he says, there's no privacy. Everybody's on top of you. But then the opposite problem was true in Middletown, Ohio, where, like he said, where every man is the king of his castle and everything is fenced off, and there's so much privacy that there's no connection.
It's cul-de-sac as commune is what I'm hearing, and I got to figure out
Yes.
how to do cottage community as commune because people only respond to alliteration in marketing, I think. But I'll take it. Cul-de-sac as commune.
Jeremy, I was afraid when you were going to ask the ultimate millennial question is you were going to ask Tim to babysit your daughter for this weekend or something. I want to wrap us up here, Tim. I'm curious. First of all, thanks for such a great conversation, and I think it's a complicated one because, to your point, I feel like it's 90% cultural, and then there's this little bit that you're trying to solve for, and I think, as Jeremy said, it's such a complicated thing: housing and financing housing and cost of land and construction, all this stuff. Just like we should be thinking about families as we're having those conversations, and I think you're right that it just doesn't come up. But give me a roadmap. Like, what are you looking into? What are you researching? You think this will lead to a book, and where can people follow you to make sure they buy it when it comes out?
I've enjoyed writing books. Again, I wrote Alienated America on kind of the collapse of community, and then Family Unfriendly on the collapse of family formation. And as someone who mostly has been tracking the problems, I am hoping to point towards the solutions. So I will be visiting and reporting on places that I think are family friendly, or that maybe should have been family friendly but don't prove to be. Try to suss out of the data. It'll be really hard to see if a certain housing type or a certain built environment type results in a higher birth rate. That might or might not be accessible. But I just started talking with the people at the Harvard program on human flourishing to talk some of the granular data that does exist on that. And, who had one more kid than they suspected, after getting married, and is that correlated with housing type? So I'm digging into all of that and hoping to turn that into a book of sort of like a family-friendly housing boom. I think on my bulletin board here it says urbanism for non-weirdos was the title my daughter came up with. And I was like, maybe we mean urbanism for families, but urbanism, most people don't quite know, but you guys know what I mean by that. So something along those lines. I'm on Twitter today. I'm fighting about how I'm sticking up for men, saying, we do housework, but sometimes it's like pulling up poison ivy and recaulking the tub if we're not washing the dishes. So I'm on Twitter at TP Carney, engaging in all this sort of stuff. But at AEI and Washington Examiner, you'll find my writing, and hopefully, again, I'll have a book in a couple of years.
Well, I endorse your daughter's recommendation, so I would pick up a book. I would pick up a book that said for non-weirdos just to see. Tim, we like to do one quick ending question, just put you on the hot seat real quick because we have entrepreneurs and innovators listening to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so just from your perspective, you have to focus on what your work is and your research.
Yeah.
If you weren't focused on that, what thing do you wish existed? What business do you wish existed? What area of research? What would you recommend to someone listening to this and say, if I had, it's kind of the magic wand question, but also if
Mhm.
you just had one thing that you would say, man, somebody should be looking into this or somebody should be building this. And I wish I could, but I've got my focus right now. What's that one thing?
I would be building townhouse developments that are really made to both be affordable, but to fill family needs. And we don't know exactly what that is. And so maybe you'd be doing some sort of A/B testing and surveys after that. But it'd be townhouses. I think a small enclosed backyard, backing up to a common play place. There's going to be parking because people need cars, but there's going to be the ability of kids to run around where they're not crossing big streets. And to the degree that there's going to be commerce nearby, I mean, not everything in the world needs to be walkable, but the things for the kids or the things for the moms with the strollers or the third places where the moms bring the kids or the dads bring the kids, that would be nearby. So is there a way to mix affordable townhouses with not every amenity one would want, but here's what parents need most? And can you build that? And I think if you could build that, that would massively spread like wildfire.
I love that. A lot of developers and builders are always sort of trying to anticipate what the needs of the community are, and they're seeing a falling birth rate, so they're thinking, "Well, I better not build that."
I want to induce the babies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I think there's truth to that. If there were more opportunities to have kids in places where you could have them, then maybe more people would want those types of homes versus kind of
Yeah.
going down to extinction like we are today. Tim, thank you very much. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
That does it for today's episode. As always, please do subscribe on any platform that you listen to us. And also feel free to email us at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com if you have thoughts, questions, any questions on this episode or comments. And also if you want to sponsor a future episode or have a topic you'd like us to talk about.
Please share our episodes so we can bring more of these. Tell us who you want to hear from and what parts of housing you want addressed. And thank you, as always, to Keenan Chen for the music.